Welcome back to another one of your flipped lectures. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about American expansion and manifest destiny in the early period of U.S. history. And what kicks off American expansion is the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. As you see on the map, all the territory that's labeled Louisiana Purchase was actually at one point owned by France. So all of this territory actually didn't even belong to the United States until the year 1803. But in 1803, the leader of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, needed money because he was fighting a bunch of wars in Europe for supremacy there. And wanting to make a buck and also to make the United States stay neutral in these conflicts, Napoleon Bonaparte sold the entirety of France's holdings in the United States for $15 million, roughly 3 cents per acre. And for $15 million in one fell swoop, this is going to more than double the size of the United States. So Thomas Jefferson was the president. You guys may know him as the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence. And he wanted to expand the country. And we're going to talk about why in just a moment. But to put in perspective how much land this is, an acre is about 57% of a soccer pitch, about 90% of an American football field. So when we're talking about 3 cents per acre, we're talking about an incredible amount of land for a very small amount of money. And the reason being is that Napoleon simply didn't really care about the holdings that that France had in the United States. So the United States doubles in size. But why does the United States even want to expand in the 1800s? I mean, the more land you have, the more you have to control and police. But the United States was going through some changes in the early 1800s. First off, there was a huge population growth that was taking place. There was a lot more citizens actually being born in the United States, and immigration started to boom starting in the 1830s, especially from places like Ireland that were experiencing some very difficult times in Europe. The other benefit of expansion was an economic advantage. As we talked about before, more land equals more resources, which usually ends up in more money and more power. And then ultimately, if you have more people, that population growth, you need more jobs and more land on which to put them. And so, if you have more people and more land, you'll have more jobs and more economic growth. So there are a lot of benefits to the United States expanding. And after the Louisiana Purchase, the United States sent 2 guys out, Lewis and Clark, you may have heard of them, as well as Sacagawea, who was their Native American guide. And Lewis and Clark were actually sent on an expedition to try to find a way out to the Pacific Ocean. And they were charged with mapping out this new part of the territory. This is a story that has a lot of great adventure, and it's a lot of fun. I encourage you guys, if you're looking for some extra credit, check out Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea's journey. But the idea is that after Lewis and Clark expanded and mapped out this territory, all of a sudden, the United States knows what is in that new territory. And so that knowledge and these new maps and this new territory is going to begin United States expansion as people start to follow in their footsteps. And this is really going to kick off the U.S. expansion, both the positive and negative consequences of that. Here is a map showing the path that Lewis, Clark, and Sacagawea took. As you can see, they set out from St. Louis, and they basically mapped out a big portion of the United States and made it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And what this led to was people following in their footsteps and settling on this territory that they had mapped out. So, again, just taking a look at the map, the United States now has expanded quite significantly. Except you notice that Spain is still laying claim to some of the United States, but that's going to change very quickly. Now, whenever we talk about history, there are always different perspectives. And so as we talk about this expansion, it's a great opportunity for us to kind of look at how history is remembered in different ways by different groups. The popular narrative, the one that is really kind of taught in a lot of schools and textbooks, is what is known as manifest destiny. We already read about manifest destiny, so you should have a good baseline for what this is talking about. And this idea of manifest destiny was the popular belief that it was the God-given destiny of the United States to spread across the continent and expand in both territory as well as wealth and influence and power. And there were three main themes of this belief. The first was the unique virtue of the U.S., its people and its institutions. This is known as American exceptionalism. And we've talked about this concept before, and it was very prevalent in the reading. There's also the idea the United States has a mission, a God-given mission to spread the ideas and institutions of the United States into new territories. In this case, it was the West. And third, the idea that it's the divine, God-given destiny of the United States to carry out this mission. So, if God is on your side, who's going to oppose you? And kind of encouraged by manifest destiny and encouraged by new opportunities, settlers in the United States started to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1800, there was only about 387,000 new settlers. By 1820, there would be 2.4 million. And this huge expansion westward began to form new states. States like Illinois and states like Missouri. So this western expansion is made up of a group of people whom we kind of call the pioneers. And they really create a new region of the country, the West. And the meaning of the West is going to change throughout the 1800s. Why, you ask? Well, because what was West actually keeps changing. West was like Georgia, then it was Illinois, then it becomes Kansas. And basically the definition of what the West is begins to change. And also the West has a different attitude than the North and the South. We talked a lot about them with the Civil War, but these pioneers are really going to have a different attitude. They're going to be a little bit rougher, a little bit simpler, a little bit kind of more self-sufficient. And a lot of them are people who are going to leave the East to look to take advantage of new lands. Where maybe you wouldn't have an opportunity to own land in the East, you could go west and you could have a new opportunity. And so kind of the main narrative that we talk about with Western expansion is really kind of this story of growth and opportunity for these settlers and these pioneers. And a couple of different groups made up these pioneers. You had your settlers, people looking to actually settle down and have a farm and a house. You had traders who helped establish cities like Nashville and St. Louis, who were the main facilitators, selling goods to people in the West and taking Western goods and selling them east. And then finally you have the third group made up of explorers and fur trappers who contributed by creating trails and served as guides for a lot of these settlers who didn't necessarily know the territory. And in popular culture, we actually remember this narrative of the pioneers with video games such as the Oregon Trail. Had a bunch of different versions of it, but if you want to have all the excitement of simulating going west and settling, you can play the Oregon Trail. And so this is all known as a grand narrative. And a grand narrative focuses on kind of one part of the story, and usually the positive part. And this grand narrative focuses on the courage, perseverance, and success of all these pioneers who settled the West. This is probably the narrative you're most familiar with, the narrative of cowboys and rugged mountain men. But who's missing from this narrative? And who's missing from this narrative are the people who lost their land as settlers expanded west. And in our case, we're going to talk about one specific narrative, the narrative of Indian removal. And so Indian removal refers to the idea that the natives of the United States, the Native Americans, American Indians, should be taken from where they were, which a lot of it was land that white settlers wanted to settle, and that they should be moved to a different part of the country. This idea was extremely popular. Manifest Destiny contributed to this, because the idea was that if God was on the side of the United States, if this was the destiny, well, then the people who were there needed to not be there anymore. So the idea was to relocate the natives to the Great Plains area, what is going to be kind of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska. And the reason that they want to move them there is because they believe that it's a wasteland and it's going to be like the worst place in the United States. And so because of that, they think, well, no one's going to actually want to live there, so if we put the natives there, then there won't be any more conflict over these good pieces of land. Very benevolent. Very benevolent. Before I talk about the actual Indian removal, how this idea goes into practice, let's give you a little bit background. So in 1828, a guy called Andrew Jackson, yeah, he's the guy in the $20 bill, was elected president. Now, Andrew Jackson had fought against natives in the U.S. Army. Jackson was a veteran. And natives were not considered to be American, despite being natives of the land, by Andrew Jackson and really by most people. And kind of very early in his presidency, Andrew Jackson comes out publicly and he states his intention to remove all the natives from the East into the western United States at this time. Again, that Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas area. So he's very upfront, the President of the United States, that this is something that is going to be a part of his agenda. And so in 1830, Congress of the United States, with the blessing of Andrew Jackson, passes the Indian Removal Act of 1830. As you can see from this political cartoon, there were some people who didn't necessarily agree with this Indian Removal Act. But widely, it's actually very popular. And what the Indian Removal Act of 1830 said was that federal money would be given to the states to relocate the Native Americans within those states. And a lot of tribes at this point give up and simply go west on their own. They understand that if they fight the United States, they will likely lose and perhaps get worse treatment. And so a lot of tribes are actually just going to give up before removal happens. But the Cherokee tribe in the state of Georgia resists legally. And if you want to resist something legally, how do you do that? Well, you go to the United States court system. And so the Cherokee tribe in Georgia, which was considered one of the civilized tribes. In the civilized tribes, that term means that many of the tribes spoke English, they had a set of laws, they dressed like regular Americans. And so in terms of a tribe that generally Americans would look at and say, well, they're like us. So the Cherokee tribe, they think they have a pretty good chance of winning this case. And so they're going to sue the state of Georgia over the proposed removal of these people from their land. And they actually win a case. It's called Worcester v. Georgia in 1832. The Supreme Court actually rules in favor of the Cherokee. So they won that the Georgia and the United States of America must respect their rights to their property. So the Cherokee won, right? They get to stay on their land, right? Well, the answer is no. President Andrew Jackson, who was very adamant about the Indian Removal Act of 1830, said, Chief Justice Marshall has made his opinion. Now let him enforce it. So Andrew Jackson, the President of the United States, is prepared to defy the Supreme Court in order to remove the Cherokee tribe from Georgia. And this is unconstitutional. This is horrible. It's an overreach of executive power because President Jackson refuses to enforce the Supreme Court's decision. The chief executive refuses to execute the laws. He violates the checks and balances. And so the American public, they should rise up in anger over this and impeach President Jackson, but they don't do anything. Indian removal is popular, and so is Andrew Jackson. And so he gets away with refusing to follow the Supreme Court's decision. And what happens next is that the next president, Martin Van Buren, is going to follow Jackson's example and send in the United States Army to remove all remaining natives from the eastern United States. And this removal is going to become known as the Trail of Tears. And the Trail of Tears was the path that the Cherokee had to take from their native lands in Georgia to their new territories in the state of Oklahoma. This is a journey that they'll have to make on foot. And they'll have to make it with very few supplies. They'll have to make it in the cold with not enough blankets. And what is going to happen is they're going to be forced to march by the United States Army. And during this march, 4,000 of 16,000, so 1/4 of the native Cherokees are going to die. They'll die of starvation. There wasn't enough food. They'll die of diseases. They'll die of exposure to the cold. and so on and so forth. In fact, 2,000 of these natives actually die in the custody of the United States Army in army camps prior to leaving on their journey. And another additional 2,000 are going to die during the long trip. So by 1838, most of the natives of the United States had been moved onto reservations in the West. And most Americans supported this idea. Very few Americans call out the government on their mistreatment of the natives and perhaps their failure to live up to the ideals of the country. And this Indian removal actually still has an impact today. This is a picture of an Indian reservation. They are still some of the most crime-ridden, poorest places in the United States. And actually, at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, an Indian reservation, it's actually the poorest place in all of the United States, the lowest per person income. And so Indian reservations today, the legacy of this history. Most of these reservations have over 40% poverty rate. They have extremely low rates of education, 50% less than the national average graduate high school. Levels of alcoholism and drug abuse are high, so are crime rates. And it's an extreme case of concentrated poverty. And it's a people who are almost completely isolated from the rest of American society, partially by choice, but mostly by circumstance. And so the other narrative, the narrative that's not the grand narrative, that celebrates kind of the courage and the benefits of expansion, they ask about the price of progress. And this is a question that historians do not agree on. The question of, does the future of the United States after Western expansion justify the collateral damage that took place during it? And I didn't even talk about the war with Mexico. That's another issue that's a part of this. But you learn about that in your other history class. But the damage, there was environmental damage to the West as cities and people come to gather resources. A lot of the natural environment is going to be destroyed by settlers looking to use those resources. Animals are going to be extremely depopulated in the West. The buffalo are going to be almost hunted to extinction. There's also going to be a huge impact on both the Native American populations and on populations in the American Southwest when the United States has a war with Mexico kind of over this same idea of manifest destiny. But other people will say the progress outweighs it, that the United States' involvement in the two world wars and the Cold War justify the fact that along the way, the United States had to kind of do some questionable things. They'll also say that the economic growth created by Western expansion meant opportunities for millions of people, that 4,000 Cherokee weighed against millions of people and their opportunities, that the progress is worth the price. Other people will say advances in science and technology, the expansion of that free society and the American way of life, that provides a higher standard of living for a large number of people, aka American exceptionalism, that last piece. And so I can't answer for you whether or not you believe that the price of progress of Western expansion was justified or not. But it's something to think about as we consider American history. So just to make my final connection here, talking about how does Western expansion fit into United States history? First off, all these new states are going to feed the debate if new states should be free or slave states, something that we talked about extensively when we looked at the Civil War. Also, the available land and resources create new opportunities for immigrants. We talked about those pull factors that made the United States so attractive, and a lot of those have to do with available land and opportunities. And eventually, Western expansion results in the continental United States, all 48 states. And finally, the United States grows powerful, grows into that world superpower as a result of the increased population, access to resources, and wealth created by Western expansion.